Hey, thanks for stopping by. Let's get right to it. So today, we'll attempt to explore some thoughts and ideas surrounding the topic of are graphics important in video games? The short and sweet of it is, yes, of course they are. Thanks for watching. But also, no, they aren't. At least, not in the way that some of us perceive them. See, I realize that by nature, most of us are visual creatures to varying degrees, but I feel that the emphasis we place on them can be a bit overzealous nowadays. Now, some of us may go as far as asking ourselves what I feel is an even better question. Do graphics make an amazing game? No, not really. You see, for most games, I think it's important to strike a visual medium that balances both artistic and visual design goals, along with gameplay, functionality, and a compelling narrative. That's pretty much a fancy way of saying that a game should set the goal of creating an aesthetic that feels timeless in its visual design. Aesthetic being the key word, which we'll explore a bit more later. One quick tidbit of where my headspace is at the moment, or more or less what I feel is a very summarized history of graphics and visual storytelling, at least for the context of this discussion. Much like the radio dramas or radio storytelling that began in the early 1920s and 30s that did not become popularized until the 50s and 60s, this was when folks would gather around the radio in the living room or wherever they had one and listen to a dramatization of a story, just words, read by different people or the same person sometimes as the listener, which allows them to be swept up in the story being told. I suppose you could think of them as modern-day graphic audio novels that would include a dramatization of your favorite book, filled with sounds, crackling fires, horses, and sword fights, all these effects that often were voiced by a myriad of voice actors. Many of the lines were spoken with gravitas and emphasis, helping you further imagine yourself as a silent participant in whatever narrative you were listening to. Of course, this was slowly overtaken by televisions in the same time frame, in the 50s and 60s. So not only could you hear an amazing story, but you could also watch one too. Skipping a bunch of stuff, like Pong in '58 and numerous other creations all leading up to the advent of video games, starting in the 70s with arcades, and of course taking the forefront in the 80s. I guess a few of those milestones could have also included things like Colossal Cave in '75, which was a text adventure game with some images, and then Asteroids in '78, which began introducing sharper and cleaner vectorized graphics. '79 saw Ultima's origin, which of course was the precursor to one of the first MMOs, known as Ultima Online. In 1981, you would begin to see more and more hardware manufacturers like IBM and Apple shifting their focus from targeting industries and businesses and programming to now focusing on the entertainment industry. I suppose it's also worth mentioning the Apple II in '84, which had superior graphics and sound to some of its predecessors, all of which began the arcade system evolution. Because you see, 1 year prior this, in '83, we had the release of the Nintendo Entertainment System. Yes, we had other systems like the Humble TV sets, Odyssey, etc., but the NES was revolutionary for its time and was the third generation of systems to truly rise above the ashes from the crash of the second generation of systems. I could go on, but I'm sure you get the picture. The 90s saw what I would call a boom, or massive advancements in graphics and performance. Not only that, but the gaming culture itself was really starting to take off and essentially placed the industry in a whole new bracket, eventually setting up a trend that would overtake the massive film and theater industries at that time. You had things like LAN parties, which was essentially you, a bunch of your buddies with like 400 wires connecting through a hub or a switch, pizza, TVs, weird smells, good times. You had games like Doom, Quake, StarCraft, Diablo, Ultima Online, EverQuest, just to name a few. But okay, that's enough of that, and a trip down memory lane. But speaking honestly, I think that when it comes to a game that strives for ultra-realism and graphical fidelity, that sometimes it can fall victim to a few pitfalls. Some of those things can be like when you play a game that is hyper-realistic, you tend to notice the flaws or artifacts and shortcomings a lot faster, because so much of that visual design is being communicated to you by simulating human environments that it's only natural that the moment you find a glitch or physics or a weird shadow, that it'll stand out much more and will sometimes break the immersion for some people. Kind of like The Matrix, I guess. I don't know. Sometimes I ask myself, what might have caused so many people nowadays to place such a great emphasis on graphics? Why is it so important? I feel like I see and hear it all the time. When I see this new game being shown for the first time in some kind of world premiere, and because its graphics might look a little last generation or not super photorealistic, that the comments and general response from people is trash, dumpster fire, garbage game. I feel like most people, like myself, can draw reasonable conclusions without really investigating the possibilities too much. One reason I think that this could be the case is that we have a lot of younger gamers who have had the luxury of essentially growing up in a generation of gaming where a high degree of graphical fidelity is more easily achieved and expected. I mean, if you think about it, you have wonderful free open source engines and tools with the ability to craft photorealistic assets which are available to just about everyone. So much so that you could say that a great deal of our generation is drowning in various forms of media and visual stimulants. I believe that this has, through some form or another, led to people finding it increasingly difficult to achieve a level of immersion that some games rely on for a good experience. I mean, perhaps another reason could be that games are already reaching such a point where graphical evolutions just aren't as visually prevalent as they were in previous generations, where you saw leaps and bounds between console generations. For example, the Dreamcast. It was so ahead of its competition at the time that it failed for being too advanced, to some degree. Many would argue, of course, that this was a mix of bad advertising, being that the previous console, the Sega Saturn, wasn't all that well received, not enough developers for both their primary and third-party games, and on top of that, it was pretty dang expensive. But more to the point is that the cost of visual fidelity will often have its drawbacks to performance. I'm not sure if anyone noticed, but if you remembered the PlayStation 5's keynote speaker discussion after the consoles were initially announced, they focused a great deal on the changes in architecture and the future-proofing of that technology, surrounding memory and hardware utilization, where it was a bit different for Xbox Series, who focused on the games and the general power of that hardware by boasting high resolutions and visual eye candy. All I'm saying is that I believe in the future generations of where the graphical fidelity of a video game will still seem important, but heavily rely on the real breadwinner, which in my mind is going to be the advancements in the hardware architecture and the symbiosis it can achieve between the two. And finally, I think another reason why we place so much emphasis on graphics is because the media marketing tells us to. In some cases, some developers have shifted much of their narrative and storytelling design to the visual anchors that represent them, which is great, but I believe it can lead to some issues down the road. Which, of course, brings me to another interesting thought about the role that advertising and marketing play in all of this. You see, in essence, graphical fidelity or eye candy has been a powerful aspect to successful games for a long time. For example, those who've been around long enough to see a classic Blizzard or League of Legends cinematic know exactly what I'm talking about. They have the uncanny ability to leave the viewer with a feeling of shock and awe after watching such a fantastic visual display for that game. However, not all cinematics are made equal, and many times the graphical representation of gameplay or other aspects of their games have landed many teams in hot water, as the final product is not always representative of the advertised visuals. You see, in my view, I think it's kind of like saying don't judge a book by its cover. This is implicitly directed towards books, which can often have crappy cover art or bland covers, and thus the phrase truly serves its purpose when used because the exterior doesn't always match the content within. But you see, for video games, it's often the difference between someone deciding to click on a game and watch a few visuals about it or skipping it altogether. So when it comes to the marketing, the graphics, or the visuals, they 100% matter, and they are part of the formula for making a successful game. So, how much of this translates into actual game development? While the subject itself can be very deep and have various perspectives and disciplines involved, I think that in general, making your game look pretty is definitely awesome. But a lot of that can come at a cost in performance, especially when approaching some aspects of hyperrealism. I've seen a sort of diagram that describes a relationship of three aspects, namely cost, quality, and time. In essence, the idea here is that you can't ever have all three in good standing. Having two is hard to achieve. The best you could hope for is one, but the others will always suffer. So having high quality will often lead to increased prices and costs, such as assets, production, etc., which have a direct impact on the time needed to accomplish those goals. That is why having established pipelines and tools to improve on some of the associated negatives is so important, but that's a whole different discussion. Another interesting side note is that as a game pushes for realism, players will often rely on real-world common sense while playing those games as well, which can also bring out a different set of problems to solve. Ultimately, I feel that graphical fidelity as a concept alone isn't what makes a game great or successful, but a design philosophy that incorporates great visual design. For instance, this could be something like adding a silhouette around a character that you're playing, which, yes, breaks the idea of realism, but improves on the visual language and design for better readability, especially when the background is littered with objects and dense details. Many games have taken creative freedoms like this by changing the visual language to be more representative in the form of stylized games or cel-shaded systems or pixel art like Minecraft. For me, it isn't just about graphics being realistic, but rather a visual design and aesthetic that feels right, a timeless graphical aesthetic. Examples of this can include games that are both artistically balanced between their visual aesthetics and their gameplay or design. World of Warcraft, for example, has the graphical aesthetic that may seem dated when compared to their modern contemporaries, but it still does a fantastic job and keeps a visual design that is representative of the world in which those visuals are employed. Team Fortress, Minecraft, Overwatch, Fortnite, Zelda, Mario, Luigi's Mansion, Yoshi's Crafted World, Shovel Knight, etc. In essence, the aforementioned are all games that, if they're played today, or 10 years from now, they will still strike a fundamental balance between their intended design philosophy and the visual aesthetic that is represented within that game. This is the essence of a timeless achievement. Nintendo, for example, has shown time and time again that you do not need cutting-edge hardware to make beautiful, functional games. In fact, they often choose hardware that is cheaper, older, and more commonly understood by its community of developers to serve as the chassis for their various platforms, which has often required deep innovation and keen art direction to push the hardware to its already well understood limits. I suppose each person will make his or her own choices at the end of the day, but for me, graphics have never really been a determinate factor when it comes to deciding to buy a game. I've often placed more value on gameplay, functionality, story, multiplayer, my friends, and for me, how closely does this game nail its intended aesthetic. I also feel that audio design is usually one of the biggest unsung heroes of some of the most successful games in the industry. If graphics and gameplay are the body, then audio is most definitely the soul of a game. A game, no matter how beautifully rendered or realistic, will be nothing more than an inert experience to its audience without the right balance of sound, music, and dialogue, which often serve as the basis for breathing life into any video game. Audio should blend that visual experience and give emotion, elevate the dialogue and the personalities of its characters, and more. Well, I've probably rambled on long enough, but I think that regardless of how people feel about graphics and their hold over modern reviews and opinions, it will continue to be something that will not change too much going forward. It's feasible that they will continue to grow increasingly realistic, mimicking our reality closer and closer in levels of accuracy, but it's also important to not forget the Picassos of this world who choose to see the world through a different lens. Maybe the differences in performances for mocap or actors to filmmaking will continue to be closely replicated within in-game assets and become almost indistinguishable. Facial de-aging techniques are quite impressive as visual effects these days. Another really interesting aspect is how the minimum bar for artists continues to grow rapidly in this space. The need for photorealistic assets creates an interesting tension for both video games and the teams that employ them. Not only due to the technical requirements to be an artist in that field, but for the games industry in general. However, by no means do I think that traditional art skills are going away, like color sense, anatomy, composition, but the need for artists to develop these technical skills is growing very rapidly. Techniques that take a unique approach to representing creativity in the world of video games will continue to present us with impressive and eye-catching experiences, and perhaps If we continue to focus on replicating the realism of human environments, we'll forget to experience some of the imagination, from epic fantasies to alien worlds, and that can often spark the creativity in all of us. Anywho, thanks for watching.